Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. As some of you may know, I just started a new podcast series that's going to be consisting of multiple episodes called The Evil Within. For the 36 years here at FFF, I've been talking about the case for freedom. That's the primary mission of the Future of Freedom Foundation, to make the case for the free society, the genuinely free society, not the reformed welfare warfare state serfdom that some people call freedom. And also, secondarily, the utilitarian case for freedom. Leads to higher standards of living, more harmonious society, a peaceful society, and so forth. But I very rarely have delved into the area of evil, and that's what I've been contemplating for the last few years. And I finally said, I need to do a series on this, because obviously making the case for freedom is one thing, making the utilitarian case for freedom, that's another thing. But evil is an entirely different world here. If you want an example, I've already posted two episodes, the introduction and part one, which deals with systems. We're not dealing with evil people here, although I'm sure there's evil people in the world, but that's not the focus of my series. The focus of my series is on systems and how these evil systems have attached themselves to our federal governmental structure, and how we can never have a good society or a free society or a prosperous, harmonious society as long as these malignant cancers are attached to the limited government republic that most of us stand for. So part one was on the national security state. I'll be continuing that series as the weeks go on. But if you want an example of evil in what's going on today, all we have to do is look at what the U.S. government's doing to Cuba, or more specifically, the Cuban people. It's horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous. This is the very essence of evil. They're targeting them with sanctions. They've been targeting them with an embargo since the Cuban Revolution back in '59, and targeting them with death by starvation, impoverishment. We all know what these sanctions do. They target the citizenry of a country with the aim of changing the policy of the government or the entire regime of the government. And that is what I consider evil. But notice that there's somewhat of a nonchalance in America about these things. It's like, you see this huge outrage, and rightly so, in Minneapolis over the killings of these two American citizens. But it's no different when the U.S. government is killing foreigners or deeply impoverishing them so that they die of starvation or die of illness because they can't get medicines or they can't get proper treatment. It's no different. And yet there's a nonchalance, an acceptance about that in our country. And that's what this whole system or series of systems that I'm going to be talking about in my series has done to the conscience of the American people. It has stultified the conscience. It's rendered them paralyzed because they've essentially rendered their conscience to Caesar as part of this whole process of attaching these evil systems to our government. But it's absolutely evil. Just read any article, Google Cuba right now, and go to the news section, and these people are really suffering. They barely have any electricity at all. The electricity is being shut down for most of the day, or at least much of the day, but they're running out of fuel. The tourist planes from Russia and Canada, because they're different. These other countries, their citizens are free to travel to Cuba and spend money there, unlike Americans, who pride themselves on living in a free society, but they're not permitted to travel to particular countries, or they'll be punished if they spend money there, punished by their own government. But these tourist planes, like from Russia and Canada, they're now having to cancel their their flights because they don't have the oil or the gasoline to service the plane's return. And so that was a bare lifeline for the Cuban society, the tourism. And then, but what really matters here is this oil siege that President Trump has put on. I mean, this is essentially a blockade. And it's not formally a blockade. It's an act of war. Blockade is where you're going to stop any ships from coming in. But as a practical matter, what Trump's doing is using his omnipotent tariff power to threaten any country that delivers oil to Cuba. He's going to use his omnipotent dictatorial tariff policy. And we all know that he has those tariff powers in America. The president can raise taxes on the American people anytime he wants to in the form of tariffs, as high as he wants to. And of course, at the same time, destroy trade with the targeted country. And so they're all scared. Nobody wants to deliver oil to Cuba, and yet that's what they need. They need that oil really bad. I mean, and Venezuela had been supporting it and sending them oil, but no more. Now with the U.S. government having taken control of Venezuela and partnering with with the Soviet Freudian slip, with the socialist, communist, narco-terrorist regime there. That's the U.S. government's own label. And then controlling the oil and making sure that it doesn't get into Cuba on purpose. I mean, they're saying we are not going to let this oil get into Cuba. And then they've pressured Mexico. Mexico has been a longtime friend of the Cuban people. They've furnished them oil, but not anymore. Now, we all know Cuba is a socialist system, and the national security establishment of the United States has been obsessed with Cuba since the Cuban Revolution. I mean, it was part of the Cold War racket, where they were claiming that Cuba is a grave threat to U.S. national security, and the Reds are coming, and this is a communist dagger pointed at America's neck, and it was all part of the racket to keep everybody afraid that the Reds are coming, and so that way you support the existence of the national security state, which I talked about in my part 2 of my series, The Evil Within. Just one great big racket. And Cuba was at the center of it. But when the Cold War ended, you would have thought, well, okay, that's it. Then we can lift the embargo now. Cold War is over. No, because of this obsession that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA have had. So it's not just President Trump that's doing this. I mean, this obsession with Cuba goes all the way back. It precedes Trump, because in '89, when the Soviet Union dismantled and everything looked like it was moving in a very positive direction in terms of peaceful and harmonious relations with the rest of the world, and the former communist world, and still some of the communist world, including Vietnam and Cuba. I mean, you would have thought that everything would have just been lifted, the embargo, abolished NATO. But no, that embargo continued on because the U.S. national security establishment has this obsession. And part of the obsession is that they defeated the CIA's invasion at the Bay of Pigs. The CIA has never forgiven them for that. But the CIA had no authority to invade a sovereign and independent country in the first place. They keep saying that, Cuba's a supporter of terrorism. Cuba's a supporter of terrorism. Cuba has never attacked the United States. Never threatened to attack the United States. Never committed any act of terrorism in the United States. I mean, this is part of the indoctrination and the propaganda to which Americans are subjected, including in the public schools, that Cuba's the aggressor, Cuba's the aggressor. Sometimes they've caught people spying for Cuba that work for the State Department, and they bring them up on charges of spying, and the federal judge says, you're a bad person, you betrayed your country. Well, no. They have not betrayed their country. They betrayed their government. That's what a lot of federal judges don't understand. These are two separate, distinct entities. The country and the government are two separate, distinct entities. But what these people have been reporting to Cuba is efforts by the U.S. government to aggress against Cuba. I mean, it's never been a defensive thing where they're giving information to the Cubans so the Cubans can attack the United States, and nothing like that. It's whatever information they've given have been the secrets that the U.S. government is doing bad things to Cuba, terrorist attacks. Remember that airplane that got shot that was coming back to Cuba that had all these young people on it, blown up in the sky. Now the CIA says, "Oh, well, that guy used to work for us, but doesn't work for us anymore." Yeah, right. As if the CIA is a great big truth teller. And then you've got assassination attempts. I mean, and this has all become normalized. This is what I was talking about in my part two of my series, The Evil Within, that assassination is just murder. And it's become normalized. There's a nonchalance about it. That's again where that conscience has been rendered unto Caesar, where people don't exercise conscience when it comes to the national security establishment and its dark side stuff, including invading a sovereign independent country, killing people in the process, trying to murder people in other countries that have never attacked the United States. This is just pure evil. And so the Cuban people are suffering mightily, and U.S. officials don't care. I mean, they are so excited that because they're saying the Cuban regime might fall. It might fall. Finally, they could say, we've had the embargo on there for 60 years, but now, boy, under President Trump, it's going to fall, it's going to fall. What they're really saying here is that the Cuban people, while they're starving to death, will finally rise up in a violent revolution and oust this regime and put in another pro-U.S. regime that will follow orders like the Venezuela regime is. Now notice, that's a communist socialist regime. But that didn't bother U.S. officials. The CIA was down there meeting with Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president of Venezuela. We all know it's an illegitimate regime. They lost the election. They stole the election. But because they have the national security establishment behind them, their version of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, Maduro was able to stay in power, regardless of the election results. But everybody understands this is a socialist communist regime, just like Cuba. But the U.S. is working with them. They're partnering with them. Okay? And so there's no moral scruples here against socialism and communism. And that's, part of the indoctrination we all learned during the Cold War that, oh no, this is really about socialism and communism. No, it's not. Especially when you have, the vast majority of Americans favor socialism, as long as it's not called socialism. We can talk about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and public schooling and the Federal Reserve and immigration controls and the whole immigration control system that's based on the socialist principle of central planning. I could go on and on of these socialist programs that Americans love. Cuba has just carried them to their logical conclusion. Like the United States has Amtrak and other government institutions, government-owned institutions. Well, so does Cuba. Cuba's just carried it to its logical extreme conclusion. But these people are really, really hurting, and it's not just because of the socialism. Now we're seeing that they were always vulnerable because of this embargo. It's just a question of how much leeway they were given in this embargo. The embargo was based on, we will punish any country that trades with Cuba and so forth. But the countries that were allied with Cuba, or at least friendly with Cuba, Venezuela, Mexico, others, they would help them out, specifically with oil. But now, with this oil siege, it's been shut down, and there's no telling what's going to happen here. But notice that, you see, the objective is that they will rise up in a big revolution against the regime there, which is a national security state, just like the United States is. Now, imagine if they were doing that to the United States, and Americans were really suffering. Some country just succeeded in enforcing sanctions, or an embargo, a blockade, and Americans were threatened with starvation and illness. Okay, so the American people say, okay, we're gonna oust the Trump regime. How would they do that? Okay, I mean, Trump has lined things up in the military establishment those soldiers are going to obey his orders. We can see that with these killings in the Caribbean. He says, kill those boat people who were without really means of defense. I guess airline carriers and so forth, B-52s, and the soldiers obey orders. And so Trump's got everything arranged there that if he says the terrorists are striking us, we need to put down the terrorists. And that's what they would be considered, people who rise up and are trying to violently overthrow the government in order to avoid starvation, like an internal regime change operation. Well, they're considered terrorists. They're considered murderers. They're not patriots and heroes standing up for their country. From the standpoint of the government, these people are bad people. And there'd be massacres of people. I mean, we all know how powerful the military is. Yes, Americans are well armed, private Americans, but there's no question that even if Americans could defeat the national security establishment in a revolution, there'd be multitudes of people dead, hundreds of thousands of people dead. And that's the same situation in Cuba. That's what they want people to do in Cuba. Cuba's a national security state. They have a Pentagon, CIA, and NSA too. It's just as tyrannical, just as controlling in Cuba. And they're going to stand with the regime. And so presumably they'll stand with the regime. I mean, they might change sides, just like the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA could change sides, but I wouldn't count on it. But what matters is that U.S. officials are willing to sacrifice all those people. They don't care. And we saw this in Iraq. It's a mirror image of what happened in Iraq. In the Persian Gulf War, George H.W. Bush had not gone to Baghdad to do a regime change on Saddam Hussein. So the next 11 years, they were using sanctions to get rid of him. Same way they've been doing with Maduro, with sanctions there. It didn't work. Same thing they've been doing with the regime in Cuba, which hasn't worked. And so they kept, these brutal sanctions were killing multitudes of Iraqi. Now there's disputes on the numbers, but Madeleine Albright, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, was asked by 60 Minutes, are the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions worth it? She didn't question the number. The number didn't matter to her. She says, yeah, it's worth it. And by it, she meant regime change, trying to get Saddam Hussein. So she was willing to sacrifice, whether it turned out to be 500,000, maybe it was less, maybe it was 200,000, 300,000 children. But that's a lot of children. That's a lot of people, a lot of innocent people to try to get this goal. That's the evil of it. And what she said was evil. But she wasn't condemned or criticized by any of her fellow government officials. She was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She's stating the official position of the U.S. government. The mainstream press in America didn't bat an eyelash because it's all been normalized. This evil has become normalized. There's a stultification of conscience. Now let me digress here. I got some minutes left. I want to digress and tell you that President Trump is not the first one to do this type of thing with oil. And I'm referring to Franklin Roosevelt. Because a lot of school kids don't understand. This is not taught in our public schools. That this was really what got the United States into World War II. It's all in the first grade and on up. It's always been billed that the Japanese had this surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They were coming to get us. They were an aggressor nation. They were going to conquer the United States, and all the preparations on the West Coast after Hawaii. The attack on Hawaii were ongoing. We had to round up all these Japanese Americans, put them in jail, and so forth. It was all bull. And Roosevelt knew it was bull, and the insiders knew it was bull, and some of us know it's bull. To understand what happened here, you go back to World War I. World War I didn't involve the United States at all. It shouldn't have involved the United States. But Woodrow Wilson gets this declaration of war. That's when presidents were still complying with the declaration of war requirement. This was before America had been converted into a national security state. And he gets us embroiled in there. But before that, before the U.S. gets embroiled, there's a stalemate there. the respective parties to World War I could not break through the lines. There was trench warfare. Neither side was powerful enough to break through the other person's line. They were thousands upon thousands of men getting killed in this vicious war. But there was no question that nobody was going to win this thing. It was a stalemate. And so the only logical outcome, unless they wanted to just keep killing indefinitely, was going to be a negotiated settlement, okay, where both sides, you give and take, and finally you have a peace treaty. And that's sometimes how wars worked out, instead of a winner and a loser. Well, the U.S. intervenes because of Wilson, because he's going to make the world safe for democracy. You see, that was his goal, that he was going to make this the war to end all wars by smashing Germany. And so the U.S. is the critical factor. All these fresh troops and industry and everything, they break through the lines. And so Germany is offered a deal that under Wilson's 14 points, that this will be the war to end all wars, and everybody will be treated justly and so forth. And the Germans say, okay, on that basis, we will surrender. Okay, and so they do. And then there's a double cross. And that was what the Treaty of Versailles was all about. After Germany had put down its armaments, they said, never mind. The European powers did. Never mind. You're going to have severe punishment inflicted on you. And the Germans said that was not the deal. We made a deal here. That was why we put our arms down. Tough luck. And now that you put your arms down, tough luck. So the Treaty of Versailles was this vicious, vicious treaty, and the Germans had no choice but to sign it. But everybody agreed. It was a betrayal. It was unjust. They made Germany admit guilt of the entire war, when clearly there was all this political machinations in Europe. Germany may have been part of it, but it's not the sole cause. And then they put reparations on them, and they separated out Germany and with Germans in there and gave them to other countries. And so when the American people are seeing this after World War I's over, they said, never again, never again. So Hitler uses the Treaty of Versailles, because people kept saying it needs to be revised, it needs to be revised. Otherwise, we're going to have a continuation of this war. And the Germans are not going to put up with this indefinitely. So Hitler, political genius, seizes on the Treaty of Versailles to rile up the German people and get them to support him. And so while he's doing this, he's building up armaments, massive spending for the military and so forth. He's getting ready just in case, because he's saying we need to rectify the Treaty of Versailles, but he's going to do it come hell or high water. And so the American people say, we want no part of this. Look what happened with World War I. What did it accomplish, though? The war to end all wars, the war for democracy. Here you got this dictator named Hitler already rising up in the 30s. And of course, you got a dictatorship in the Soviet Union as well. And that was an outgrowth of World War I as well. So you've got the American people, I don't know what the numbers were, but it was like 80% against entry into the war. So Roosevelt couldn't get a declaration of war. And again, this is when presidents were following the Constitution. You have to get a congressional declaration of war before you can wage war. So he tried to bait the Germans into attacking the United States in the Atlantic, and Hitler refused to take the bait. He could see what Roosevelt was up to. So Roosevelt decides, well, if I can get a war going in the Pacific, then that could be a back door to getting involved in the European war against Germany. And he was assuring Churchill. See, France and Great Britain had declared war on Germany, not the other way around. When Germany invades Poland, it's Britain and France that declare war on Germany. And of course, without any military capability of saving Poland. And then shortly thereafter, Russia, the Soviet Union, invades Poland as well, the other half, pursuant to the deal they'd made with Hitler. But Britain and France don't declare war on the Soviet Union. So American people say, we want no part of this. So Roosevelt figured out a way. He says, if I can put the squeeze on Japan, I can get them to attack the United States, and then the Congress won't have a choice. And that's exactly what he did. And that was his goal, that he had this oil siege where he was doing everything he could, all this maneuvering to deny oil to Japan. It was the same thing that we see in Venezuela, same thing in principle that we see with Cuba, only we're dealing with Japan now. And Japan had invaded China. They had a huge army there. They needed the oil. And Roosevelt knew they needed the oil. And so it was the same thing. Roosevelt was saying the same thing that we hear today about, the Japanese need to sit down and talk. We need to negotiate a solution to this. And the Japanese said, okay, let's sit down and talk. But Roosevelt kept putting on these humiliating demands. He didn't want a deal. And Japan kept saying, we're willing to do this and this and this. And Roosevelt, they knew that Japan was a very proud nation, and so they kept putting these humiliating terms, that knowing that they would never accept it. But squeezing and watching the Japanese as they were getting squeezed. Now, of course, Cuba's not going to attack the United States. They're just going to die. That's just the way the Iraqi children just died. I mean, there was no way that Iraq was going to be able to do anything, attack the United States and so forth. But Japan had an opportunity to do that. So Japan thought, okay, we got one shot at this thing. And there's oil in the Dutch East Indies. And so it's pretty certain that if we go in there and get that oil, that Roosevelt's going to extend his oil siege there and send the Pacific Fleet over there and stop the oil from being taken out of the Dutch East Indies. So that was the whole purpose of attacking at Pearl Harbor, was to knock out the American fleet. It was not to invade the United States, not to conquer the United States. They had no military capability to do that at all. It was just, let's knock out their fleet. We got our oil. Everything's fine. They won't be able to do anything about it. So it was a limited type thing as compared to, attacking the United States with the aim of conquering the United States. So that's why the whole West Coast preparations were ridiculous. And the United States had broken through the Japanese, at least the diplomatic codes. That's unequivocal. That's undisputed. So they were reading the diplomatic messages, and they could see that Japan was preparing for an attack. But Roosevelt wanted that attack. Now, there's disputes as whether he knew it was coming in at Pearl Harbor. I think the evidence is clear that he did, the way he treated the commanders at Pearl. For example, at the last minute when Japan's burning all their stuff and everything, and it's coming through the wire and they're breaking the code and seeing this, they sent a warning to the Pearl commanders the slowest possible way possible. I mean, they could have picked up the phone and said, get ready. But they sent the message of get ready. I think it arrived after the attack started because they didn't want to interfere with the attack. Now, Roosevelt got the aircraft carriers out of Pearl because they needed those aircraft carriers, but he left, I think, destroyers or a couple of warships there and so forth as bait. And the Japanese took the bait. And they thought it was a tremendous victory, and it had the appearance of this tremendous successful attack, but it wasn't at all, because they end up getting defeated at the Battle of Midway shortly thereafter. And there's people that believe that the U.S. had broken the military codes too, but that's still secret. The U.S. will not reveal that information based on grounds of national security. Imagine that, World War II, and they're still keeping secret whether they had broken the Japanese military codes. But every indication is they had. And the troops in the Philippines, I mean, like, what are American troops doing in the Philippines? That's a long way from the United States. But they're bait, because they knew that if the Japanese attacked and killed a bunch of troops in the Philippines, that would be an act of war too. So that they were bait there, and they were bait at Pearl. Roosevelt was willing to sacrifice those soldiers in order to get into the war, and it worked, because they attack at Pearl, and Roosevelt has this shocked look on his face. Oh my gosh, we're shocked. He wasn't shocked at all. That's just a huge lie. He was satisfied. He was relieved that it finally had happened. But he still had to get into the war in Europe, you see, because theoretically it could have just been a declaration of war against Japan, not against Germany. Well, Germany had a pact with Japan, and so I think Hitler made a big mistake by declaring war on the United States. He should have just waited to see what Congress did, but he declares war on the United States, and that was it. Roosevelt got what he wanted. He got the war in the Pacific, but really that was secondary. What he wanted was war in the European continent, World War II, and it's always been billed that, the United States won World War II. No, they didn't. The United States didn't win. Neither did France or Great Britain. It looks like that. But France and Great Britain lost their empires. They became second-rate nations. Okay? They were powerful when they first declared war. At the end of the war, they're second-rate nations. The United States technically won, defeated Nazi Germany, but guess who ends up with Poland, Czechoslovakia, and all of Eastern Europe, the Baltics? Stalin. Soviet Union. It's Stalin that won the war. And then look what happens to the American people. I mean, Americans were right to not want to go into World War II. We end up with the Cold War racket. We end up converting the federal government to a national security state, which is a totalitarian form of governmental structure. It doesn't have to comply with the Constitution. Power of assassination, power of torture, power of indefinite detention against Americans as well as foreigners. We live under omnipotent government now, and we have ever since. As I said in part 2, this was the great destroyer of freedom. Americans don't realize it. They treat the national security state as a god. And that's where they've rendered their conscience. They don't see the evil of these sanctions of killing people and stuff. It's just shocking to me. It's repugnant. But that's how we end up with where we are today with omnipotent government. And you got to understand, it goes all the way back to World War I, but the immediate cause of that World War II was that oil siege. So the ultimate answer here, and I'll be going to this more into my series, The Evil Within, is you got to dismantle these evil systems. They're like malignant cancers. And I've dealt with one. That's the national security state system. But I'll be dealing with more. And, of course, part of this is the evil of sanctions. That's Trump Watch. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you always, as always, for your support of FFF. We're very, very appreciative. I'll see you next week.